Hello, my little ones and big ones and in-between ones. I'm going to read a biography to you today. There's a couple of those on these videos I'm doing. There's another one, Johnny Appleseed, and a tall tale retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg. There's lots of books about Johnny Appleseed, but I'm John Chapman is his real name. You're going to learn that here, but there's the back. I chose this one just because I really like the visual, and since we're doing a recording, I thought it'd be nice for you to see some great pictures. There's the little, I want you to look here. Whoops. Yeah. All right, let's get started. I know a lot of you guys already know about Johnny Appleseed, so let's read this again. And I just love the illustrations. That is a great looking apple tree, isn't it? So cool. So cool. John Chapman, who later became known as Johnny Appleseed, was born on September 26, 1774. When the apples on the trees surrounding his home in Leominster, Massachusetts, were as red as the autumn leaves. John's first years were hard. His father left the family to fight in the Revolutionary War, and his mother and his baby brother, they both died before his second birthday. By the time John turned 6, his father had remarried and settled in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Within a decade, their little house was overflowing with 10 more children. And nearby was an apple orchard. Like most early American families, the Chapmans picked their apples in the fall, stored them in the cellar for winter eating, and also used them to make sauces and apple cider vinegar, and apple butter. John loved to watch the spring blossoms slowly turn into the glowing fruit of autumn. So there's a house full of kids. And here's the apple orchard. Watching the apples grow inspired in John a love of all of nature. He often escaped from his boisterous household to the tranquil woods. Tranquils, calming, quiet. The animals sensed his gentleness and they trusted him. Well, that's my phone. It's going to do that again, so let me just do this real quick so it doesn't do it again. Okay. As soon as John was old enough to leave home, he set out to explore the vast wilderness to the west. When he reached the Allegheny Mountains, he cleared a plot of land and he planted a small orchard with the pouch of apple seeds that he'd carried with him. John walked hundreds of miles through the Pennsylvania forest, living like the Indians that he befriended on the trail. As he traveled, he cleared the land for many more orchards. He was sure the pioneer families would be arriving before long, and he looked forward to supplying them with apple trees. When a storm struck, he found shelter in a hollow log, or he would build a lean-to. But on clear nights, he just stretched out under the stars. Over the next few years, John continued to visit and care for all his new orchards that he had planted. The winter slowed him down, but he survived happily on a diet of butternuts. So here he is, sleeping out in the open. And here's winter. He's living in a little hollow there, safe. One spring, he met a band of men who boasted that they could lick their weight in wildcats. That's kind of a different term they used to be victorious over, or to win, not literally to lick cats. I know you guys heard me say that. I'm like, what? Lick cats? They're amazed to hear that John would not hurt an animal, and he had no use for a gun. So these guys wanted to hunt wild cats. They challenged John to compete at wrestling. It was the favorite frontier sport. He suggested a more practical contest, a tree chopping match, and the woodsman eagerly agreed. But what has Johnny Appleseed been doing his whole life, right? And here's an illustration of all of them chopping, chopping, chopping. When the sawdust settled, there was no question about who had come out on top. Well, John was pleased that the land for his largest orchard had been so quickly cleared. He thanked the exhausted woodsmen for their help, and he began planting. Wasn't that clever of him? Instead of a contest to see who could kill the most animals with their guns, he said, how about if we see who could chop down the most trees? And then it cleared all the land for his new orchard. He got them to do it for him, thinking it was a contest. I love that. It's one of my favorite little stories there. Well, during the next few years, John continued to move west. Whenever he ran out of apple seeds, he hiked to the eastern cider presses to replenish his supply. And before long, John's plantings were spread across the whole state of Ohio. Meanwhile, pioneer families were arriving in search of home sites and farmland. John had located his orchards on the routes that he thought they would most likely be traveling. And as he hoped, the settlers were eager to buy his young trees. They're in the little bags, ready to go. John went out of his way to lend a helping hand to his new neighbors. Often he would give his trees away. People affectionately called him Johnny Appleseed, and so he began using that name. He particularly enjoyed entertaining children with tales of his wilderness adventures and stories from his Bible. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in another war against the Americans, and the settlers feared that Ohio would be invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved Johnny that his friends were fighting each other, but when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night and shouted a warning at every door. Well, after the war, people urged Johnny to build a house and settle down, but he replied that he lived like a king in his wilderness home, so he returned to the forest he loved. During his long absences, folks enjoyed sharing their recollections of Johnny, and they retold his stories, and sometimes they even exaggerated them a little bit. Some recalled Johnny sleeping in a treetop hammock, chatting with the birds. And others, they remembered that a rattlesnake had attacked his foot. Fortunately, Johnny's feet were as tough as elephant's hide, so the fangs didn't penetrate. Hang on. Hold on. Sorry. Sorry about that. So the fangs didn't penetrate. I think that's actually a true story. His feet were so tough from walking barefoot. Hopefully that phone won't ring again. It was said that Johnny had once tended a wounded wolf and then kept him for a pet. An old hunter swore he had seen Johnny frolicking with a bear family. Well, the storytellers all out... Oh, excuse me. The storytellers outdid each other with tall tales about his feats of survival in the untamed wilderness. It's my mom calling. There's illustration of all the crazy stories. Fighting a cougar, playing with bears, fish bigger than him. All these crazy tales. As the years passed, Ohio became too crowded for Johnny. He moved to the wilds of Indiana, where he continued to clear land for his orchards. And when the settlers began arriving, Johnny recognized some of the children who had listened to his stories. And now they had children of their own. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked to hear his tales again. When Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up with his work. And then in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the very first time in his life. So Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin. A few days later, he died there. Probably pneumonia, maybe, huh? Curiously, Johnny's stories continued to move westward without him. Folks maintained that they'd seen him in Illinois, or that he greeted them in Missouri or Arkansas or Texas. Others were certain that he'd planted trees on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains, or even in California's distant valleys. Even today, people still claim that they have seen Johnny Appleseed. I'm going to read this author's note. Here we go. The legends that grew up around John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed, began during his lifetime in the last quarter of the 18th and the first half of the 19th centuries. Since then, an enormous amount has been written about him. I explored much of that literature before beginning my picture book version of his life and adventures, and I was surprised to learn from a West Virginia historian writing in 1859 that John Chapman had a Bunyan-esque talent. Paul Bunyan, you guys remember Paul Bunyan, the story of Paul Bunyan? If not, look him up. And this allowed him to chop as much wood, as many trees in one day, as most men could do in 2 days. In recalling his childhood memories of John Chapman, this historian, Mr. Curtis, he wrote, "He was very fond of children, and he would talk to me a great deal, telling me of all the hardships he had endured, of his adventures, and his hairbreadth escapes by flood and field." While John Chapman's zestful retellings of his adventures inspired others as well. Henry Howe recorded Johnny Appleseed anecdotes that were circulating in Ohio 20 years after his departure for Indiana. In his book, Howe described him as a man who went barefoot, often traveling miles through the snow. In that way, he was careful not to injure any animals, and he thought hunting was morally wrong. He was welcomed everywhere among the settlers, and he was treated with great kindness by the Indians. As the years passed, the stories got reinterpreted and retold, and a sentimentalization of Johnny Appleseed became discernible. Soon the identity of the initial inspiration became lost in this romanticized outpouring of stories, poems, and plays. One of those contributors was Miss Rosella Rice, a 19th century Ohio novelist, who spoke about Johnny Appleseed's memory, glowing in our hearts. His deeds live anew every springtime in the fragrance of the apple blossoms he loved so well, she wrote. The facts of John Chapman's life emerged again thanks to some research of Dr. Robert Price. He published a book about Johnny Appleseed, Myth and Man, Man and Myth. He concluded that when a folk tale attains the status of a myth and embodies a cherished ideal of the people, well, then its true worth no longer lies in the facts that may have inspired it, but now in the new living creating force that it has become. In my picture book, what I tried to do was weave incidents and images from the frontier life of John Chapman with those myths that continue to be inspired by Johnny Appleseed, who was the most gentle, generous, and beloved of America's mythic figures. And this is Johnny Appleseed Country. I'm going to show you. It kind of shows everywhere. The War of 1812, Indiana, Ohio, the Ohio counties, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, all the places he went. And that's it. Johnny Appleseed. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. And I apologize for my phone ringing. It was my mom calling me twice. So guess what I'm going to do right now? I'm going to stop my video now that we're done. I'm going to call my mom back and tell her why I hung up on her. Bye, guys.